sky bleached white with heat, and by noon, the air shimmered in waves that made the horizon dance and dissolve. This wasn't the pleasant warmth of early summer, when green grass ripples under gentle breezes. This was heat that cracked the earth open. Heat that turned once lush grasslands into expanses of brittle brown stalks that crunched under every step. The drought began in spring and never broke. April rains that usually soaked the plains and coaxed prairie grass to shoulder height simply didn't come. May stayed dry. By June, the creeks that normally ran year-round had become chains of stagnant pools, shrinking daily, ringed with the desperate tracks of cattle and wildlife competing for every drop. Ranchers watched their grasslands with growing unease, but not yet alarm. Bad years happened. The West was unpredictable. Surely the rains would come eventually. Surely this was just a temporary dry spell. They were running more cattle than the land had ever supported. That was the problem, though few admitted it. The cattle boom of the early 1880s had been intoxicating. Eastern investors and European nobility had poured money into Western ranching, seduced by stories of limitless grass and cattle that reproduced themselves into fortunes. Ranchers who'd started with a few hundred head now ran thousands. Some operations counted their cattle in the tens of thousands. The math was simple and irresistible. Cattle bought in Texas for $10 a head could be driven north, fattened, on free grass, and sold in Chicago for $40, $50, sometimes $60. The Great Plains were an enormous, rent-free feedlot. The grass was free, the water was free. All you needed was cattle and cowboys to watch them, except the grass wasn't limitless, and the water wasn't guaranteed, and running 10 times more cattle than the land could sustainably support worked fine until conditions turned bad. That summer, conditions turned very bad indeed. Prairie fires became constant. The dry grass ignited from lightning strikes, from careless campfires, from sparks off, wagon wheels striking rocks. Once started, fires raced across the plains for miles, sometimes days, consuming what little forage remained. Cowboys fought these fires with wet blankets and desperate prayer, but mostly they just watched the range burn, knowing each acre of blackened stubble meant less food for the cattle that fall in winter. By late summer, water sources that had never gone dry in memory went dry. Springs that had sustained homesteads for years simply stopped flowing. Rivers that normally ran strong became braided trickles through wide, cracked mudflats. Ranchers began to panic, moving herds constantly in search of water and grass, often finding neither. The cattle themselves began to show the strain. They should have been fat and sleek, building reserves for winter. Instead, their ribs became visible. Their hip bones protruded. They moved sluggishly, conserving energy because they weren't getting enough food to burn. Range cows that should have weighed 900 pounds were coming in at 600, 700 if they were lucky. And still, the cattle companies shipped in more stock. The pressure from investors back east, from shareholders in London and Edinburgh who'd never seen a prairie or a longhorn, was relentless. Maximize the herd. Use every acre. The reports sent back to investors spoke of temporary setbacks and cyclical weather patterns, but projected ever-increasing profits. The cowboys knew better. In bunkhouses and around campfires, they talked about what was coming. You didn't need to be a genius to do the math. Cattle going into winter already weak, grass already depleted, and winter always came to Montana, always came to Wyoming and Dakota. The question wasn't whether winter would be hard. Winter was always hard. The question was whether the cattle and the men who tended them could survive it in their already weakened state. Then came the signs. The old-timers noticed first. In early November, almost a month earlier than usual, the geese began flying south, not in their typical leisurely migrations, but in huge, urgent flocks that darkened the sky and flew from dawn to dusk. They weren't stopping to feed in the prairie ponds. They were getting out. Beavers, whose lodges dotted every creek and river, were observed gathering more wood than anyone had ever seen. They piled branches and logs until their lodges looked like timber fortresses rising from the water. Animals preparing for something. The cattle themselves grew thicker coats, not just the usual winter hair, but shaggy, dense fur that made them look like bison. Ranch hands joked about it nervously. "Looks like the cows know something we don't," they'd say, and try to laugh, but the laughter always sounded forced. Weather-wise ranchers, men who'd spent decades reading the land and sky, felt it in their bones. The air pressure fluctuated wildly. The wind patterns shifted strangely. The autumn sunset cast peculiar colors across the clouds, orange and purple and sickly green, like bruises spreading across the horizon. November brought the first snow, not the gentle, melting dustings that sometimes came and went in autumn, but real snow. Serious snow. It fell for 3 days, accumulated to 8 inches in places, and when it finally stopped, the temperature dropped below zero for the first time that season. That snow melted eventually, as November snow often did, but it served as warning. Winter was coming early. Winter was going to be serious. The smart ranchers, the cautious ones, began laying in extra hay, stockpiling firewood, bringing cattle closer to ranch headquarters, where they could be watched and, if necessary, fed through bad stretches. But most didn't. Most couldn't. The scale of operations had grown too large. You couldn't barn 20,000 head of cattle. You couldn't buy enough hay to feed them through a Montana winter even if you wanted to. The entire business model of open-range ranching depended on cattle foraging for themselves, year-round, regardless of weather. This had worked mostly for years. The previous winters had been unusually mild. Cowboys spoke wistfully of the winter of '85, when temperatures barely dropped below freezing and cattle grazed comfortably all season. Or '84, when snow came late and melted early. They'd gotten complacent. The land had been kind, and they'd mistaken kindness for weakness. In December, the unease grew. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. The sky stayed overcast for weeks, a low ceiling of grey that pressed down like a lid. Snow fell intermittently, never enough to cause real problems, but enough to dust the brown grass white and make foraging harder for cattle already struggling. Christmas came and went. Cowboys celebrated in bunkhouses with what meager supplies they had. Some ranches managed a turkey or goose. Most made do with beans and bacon and whatever whiskey had survived the year. They sang songs and told stories and pretended everything was normal, but the worry was always there. A cold knot in every stomach. New Year's Day, 1887 dawned clear and brutally cold, -20 degrees in some places, but clear. You could see for miles, the snow-dusted prairie rolling away to a horizon sharp as a knife edge. Cowboys rode out to check on cattle, found them bunched in coulees seeking shelter from the wind, but alive, still managing. For 8 more days, the cold held, but remained bearable, survivable. Cattle poured through snow to reach grass. Cowboys kept fires burning in bunkhouses and took turns on night watch. Ranchers' wives cooked enormous meals, knowing their men needed calories to stay warm. And then came January 9th. The morning started deceptively calm. The killing wind from the north that had blown for days suddenly stopped. The temperature rose, slightly enough that men went out without their heaviest coats. There was even talk of a Chinook coming, one of those warm winds that could raise temperatures 40 degrees in an hour and melt snow in a day. But this wasn't a Chinook coming. This was something else entirely. The calm before the storm isn't just a saying. It's meteorological reality. The stillness that morning was the pressure dropping, the atmospheric conditions realigning, the sky gathering its strength to unleash something that would be remembered for generations. By mid-morning, the first flakes fell. By noon, the world had disappeared into white, and the temperature, instead of rising, began to fall, and fall, and fall, until cold became something no one on the northern plains had experienced before, until winter stopped being a season and became an enemy that wanted everything dead. The autumn of warnings was over. The winter of death had arrived. The bunkhouse sat low against the prairie, a squat rectangle of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss that had dried and cracked over successive seasons. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to be built quickly and cheaply to house as many men as possible in the smallest space and to provide just enough shelter to keep those men alive through winter so they could work come spring. Most bunkhouses were single rooms, maybe 30 feet long and 15 wide, with a ceiling, so low a tall man had to duck under the support beams. The logs were never properly squared, so gaps showed between them, filled haphazardly with whatever materials were at hand. Clay, newspaper, old rags, horsehair mixed with mud. In winter, you could stand in the middle of the room and see daylight, through a dozen cracks, and where light came through, so did wind. The door was thick plank, hung on leather hinges because metal hinges were expensive and had to be freighted in from distant towns. It never quite fit the frame, so a gap at the bottom let in a constant stream of cold air that flowed across the floor like invisible water. Cowboys stuffed rags under it every night. By morning, frost would have formed on those rags, turning them stiff as boards. There was usually one window, if you could call it that, a square cut in the logs, covered with oiled paper stretched over a wooden frame. Or if the ranch had any money, actual glass brought in at considerable expense and constantly at risk of cracking in the cold. Most bunkhouses just had the oiled paper, which let in a murky amber light during the day and absolutely nothing at night. The bunks lined both long walls, stacked 2 or 3 high depending on how many men the ranch employed. Each bunk was nothing more than a wooden frame, rope webbing stretched across it in a grid. And on top of that, if you were lucky, a thin mattress stuffed with prairie hay. If you weren't lucky, just the rope webbing and whatever blankets you owned. The hierarchy of bunks was established and rigid. New men got the worst spots. Bottom bunks on the end nearest the door, where the cold draft flowed constantly and you'd be stepped on every time someone went outside to piss in the middle of the night. Top bunks were warmer because heat rose, but they put you closest to the roof where moisture from everyone's breath condensed and dripped. You'd wake with water spots on your blankets, sometimes ice if it was cold enough. Middle bunks away from the door were prime real estate, warmer than the bottom, drier than the top, away from traffic. Senior cowboys claimed these spots and defended them jealously. If you wanted one, you either waited years or fought for it, and fighting in a bunkhouse full of armed men rarely ended well for anyone. At the center of the room stood the stove, a cast-iron barrel stove or, in better bunkhouses, an actual manufactured stove with a proper firebox and damper. The stovepipe ran up through the roof, and where it pierced the ceiling, there was supposed to be a metal collar to prevent fires. There often wasn't. More than one bunkhouse had burned down from a too-hot stovepipe, igniting dried wood and old bird nests lodged in the rafters. The stove was life. When it was burning hot, the men closest could almost be comfortable. 5 feet away, you could still be cold. 10 feet away, in a corner bunk, you might as well be outside. The stove created a temperature gradient so steep that men on one side of the room would be sweating, while men on the other shivered under piled blankets. Feeding the stove was a constant concern. Firewood was precious. Trees were scarce on the open plains, and what wood existed had to be hauled in by wagon from river bottoms or mountainsides miles away. Some ranches burned coal shipped in by rail, but coal cost money, and ranchers were notoriously cheap about anything that didn't directly increase cattle numbers. More often, cowboys burned whatever they could find: dried cow chips, sagebrush, buffalo bones, of which there were still plenty scattered across the plains from the great slaughter of a decade earlier. None of these burned hot or long. You had to feed the stove constantly to maintain any heat at all. At night, someone had to take responsibility for the fire. Usually, this rotated among the men, with each taking a shift to wake periodically and add fuel. Miss your shift, let the fire go out, and you'd wake to find 20 angry cowboys ready to throw you outside in your underwear to see how you liked the cold. Even with the stove going, the bunkhouse was never truly warm in winter. It was less cold than outside, which was the best that could be hoped for. Your face would be hot from the stove, while your back was cold from the draft. Your feet would be numb while sweat trickled down your spine. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival, was the goal. Make it to morning alive and functional. That was success. Cowboys slept in their clothes. The idea of changing into night clothes, or worse, sleeping naked, was absurd. You slept in your wool shirt, your long underwear, your thick socks. On the coldest nights, you kept your pants on. Your hat stayed on your head or under it as a pillow, because hats were expensive, and you didn't want someone stealing yours while you slept. Boots were the exception. You took off your boots because sleeping in boots was miserable, and because boots needed to dry. They'd sit by the stove all night, the leather slowly warming and releasing the accumulated moisture of the day. The smell of drying leather mixed with the smell of unwashed men, wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the acrid tang of burning sage or cow chips. The smell of a bunkhouse was indescribable to anyone who hasn't experienced it. 40 men living in close quarters, bathing rarely because hauling and heating water was labor-intensive and rarely worth the effort. Clothes worn for weeks or months without washing, because washing meant they'd be wet and might not dry in winter, and wet clothes could kill you. The privy was outside, so men used a bucket in the corner at night rather than brave the cold, and that bucket added its own special contribution to the atmosphere. Tobacco smoke hung in layers because every cowboy who could afford it smoked too, passed the time. Some chewed and spit into cans or just onto the floor because the floor was already a mess of tracked-in mud, snow, manure, and spilled food. Mice lived in the walls and came out at night to scavenge. You could hear them scratching and squeaking, see them dart across the floor in the stove light. Some cowboys tried to kill them. Most gave up. There were always more mice, as long as they didn't chew holes in your blankets or get into the food. Stores, you learned to coexist. The sounds of a bunkhouse at night were particular. The wind outside, constant, varying from low moan to sharp whistle, depending on its strength and the gaps it found. The stove ticking as metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The creak of rope webbing as men shifted in their bunks, the thump of boots being pulled off and dropped on the floor. Snoring. Dear God, the snoring. 40 men in one room meant you'd have at least 10 serious snorers. Deep, rattling snores that shook the bunks. High, whistling snores that pierced through any attempt at sleep. Snores that stopped and started, until you'd lie there waiting for the next one, unable to relax. Sometimes men would throw boots at particularly bad snorers. Sometimes it helped. Usually it just made everyone else laugh and the snorer angry. Coughing was constant. The cold, the dust, the smoke, the close quarters meant everyone had some kind of lung affliction. Dry, hacking coughs that went on for minutes. Wet, rattling coughs that made you wonder if the man would survive the night. Cowboys coughed themselves, awake, coughed themselves back to sleep, coughed their way through the entire winter. Conversations happened in the dark. Men talked about home, about women, about cattle, about anything but the cold pressing in from all sides. Some conversations were quiet, just between neighbors in adjacent bunks. Others involved the whole room, stories being told and retold, jokes that weren't funny but made everyone laugh because laughter was warmth of a different kind. Letters were read and reread by stovelight. A letter from home was precious, and a cowboy might read the same letter 100 times through a winter, memorizing every word, every loop of handwriting, every piece of news from a world that felt impossibly far away. Some men prayed. You'd hear whispered prayers in the darkness, usually from the younger cowboys, the ones still new enough to the work that death seemed like a possibility rather than an inevitability. Older hands didn't pray much. They'd made their peace with whatever was coming, or they'd stopped believing anything was listening. The bedding itself deserves attention. Each cowboy owned his own bedroll, a collection of blankets, and maybe a quilt that he'd rolled up and carried with him from job to job. These blankets were wool, heavy and scratchy, and they accumulated the smell of their owner, along with the smell of horses, cattle, campfire smoke, and prairie dirt. In the bunkhouse, you'd unroll your bedding onto the rope webbing, which sagged under your weight and provided almost no cushioning. The ropes left permanent patterns pressed into your back and legs. After a few weeks, you stopped noticing. Your body just accepted that sleep meant discomfort and adjusted expectations accordingly. On the coldest nights, men piled every blanket they owned on top of themselves. 3 blankets, 4, 5 if they had them. The weight was crushing, but weight meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. Some cowboys, the poorest ones or the newest, didn't have enough blankets. They'd sleep in their coats, under their coats, wrapped in saddle blankets that smelled of horse sweat and mold. The truly desperate would share bunks, 2 men pressed together for body heat, which was awkward and carried implications, but was better than freezing. You'd see this more in the deepest cold, when propriety mattered less than waking up with all your fingers and toes. Getting into bed was a shock every night. The blankets had been sitting in the ambient temperature of the bunkhouse all day, which meant they were cold. Not frozen, but cold enough that sliding under them made you gasp. Your body heat would eventually warm the space between blankets, but it took 20 minutes, half an hour, of shivering and curling into yourself before that happened. Some cowboys heated rocks in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to put in their bunks. This worked for about an hour, providing a spot of genuine warmth for your feet or your hands. After that, the rocks were just heavy, cooling lumps taking up space, and you'd have to decide whether the effort of getting up and throwing them out was worth the loss of heat from opening your blanket cocoon. Sleep, when it finally came, was never restful. You were always partially aware of the cold trying to find you, aware of the fire and whether it was still burning, aware of the other men around you, their sounds and movements, aware that if something went wrong, a fire, a medical emergency, a blizzard bad enough that the whole bunkhouse might collapse, you needed to be able to wake and move. Cowboys learned to sleep light, a skill born of necessity. In summer, you slept light because you might need to deal with stampeding cattle or approaching storms. In winter, you slept light because the alternative was dying without noticing. The nights stretched long, 15, 16 hours of darkness in the depths of winter. You couldn't stay awake for all of it. Candles and lamp oil were too expensive to burn for light. So you slept in stages. A few hours, then wake when the fire needed tending. A few more hours, wake because your body was too cold or needed to piss. A few more hours, wake because someone else was moving around, or coughing, or because your back hurt too much to stay in one position. This broken sleep was exhausting in its own way. You'd wake in the morning having technically slept for hours but feeling like you'd barely rested at all. That was winter sleep in a bunkhouse. Not the deep, renewing sleep of comfortable beds in warm rooms, but the fitful, survival-focused sleep of men living on the edge of catastrophe, every single night, for months on end. And when the great die-up came, when the temperature dropped to 60 below, and the wind tried to tear the roof off, and the cattle began dying by the thousands, that inadequate sleep became nearly impossible. Because how do you sleep when the world outside is ending? How do you close your eyes when you know morning might reveal losses beyond comprehension? You learn because you have no choice. You sleep because your body demands it. Brief, shallow, troubled sleep punctuated by periods of lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind scream, and wondering if you'll live to see spring. Morning came late on January 9th, the sun rising somewhere behind thick grey clouds that had settled over the plains like a lid. Cowboys rolled out of their bunks around 6, the usual time, groaning and stiff from another night on rope webbing and thin mattresses. The bunkhouse was cold, but not impossibly so. Maybe 20 degrees inside, which meant the fire had held through the night. That was a victory. They pulled on boots that had spent the night by the stove, the leather still warm to the touch, stomped their feet to get blood flowing, stretched arms and backs that ached from the perpetual cold. Someone got the coffee going, pouring water from buckets that had a thin skim of ice on top despite being inside. The foreman, a weathered man named Jack Thompson, on one particular ranch in Montana, stuck his head out the door to check conditions. The wind that had been blowing, Hard from the north for days had stopped completely, dead calm. The air felt heavy, thick, like you could almost chew it. Temperature had risen slightly overnight, maybe up to freezing, or close to it. Might be a Chinook coming, Jack said, and a few of the men perked up. A Chinook, that warm wind that could raise temperatures 40 degrees in an hour, would be salvation, would give the cattle a break, would let everyone breathe a little easier. But the old-timers in the room, men who'd spent 20-30 winters on the northern plains, exchanged glances and said nothing. The calm felt wrong. The air pressure made their joints ache more than usual. This wasn't a Chinook. This was something else. Breakfast was the usual. Beans warmed up from the night before. Fried salt pork. Biscuits if the cook had bothered to make them, which he usually didn't. Coffee, hot and bitter and strong enough to dissolve the spoon. The men ate quickly, not talking much. Mornings were for eating and getting warm before heading out into the workday. By 8 o'clock, men were saddling horses, checking cattle in nearby pastures, hauling water from the creek, which involved breaking through ice that had gotten thicker each day. The world was grey and still. Snow covered everything in a lumpy white blanket, but it was old snow, crusted and dirty. Nothing new falling yet. Around mid-morning, maybe 10 or 10:30, someone noticed the first flakes. Tiny things, falling straight down. No wind to push them sideways. They accumulated on coat sleeves, on hat brims, on the backs of cattle who stood motionless, already conserving energy. Within 30 minutes, the flakes had gotten larger and were falling more densely. The grey sky seemed to lower, pressing down, until it felt like you could reach up and touch it. Visibility, which had been miles, dropped to maybe a quarter mile, then less. Cowboys on the range started heading back to the bunkhouse. This was going to be a storm, and you didn't want to be caught out in a storm. The foreman sent riders to gather men from distant line camps to make sure everyone got back to the main ranch before conditions got bad. But conditions got bad faster than anyone expected. By noon, the wind returned. Not gradually building, but suddenly, like someone had opened a door. It came from the north, from Canada, from the Arctic, and it came with a howl that made horses shy and men grab for their hat brims. The temperature, which had been hovering near freezing, began to fall. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 5. The wind picked up the falling snow and threw it horizontally. Visibility dropped to 50 feet, then 20. Within an hour of the wind starting, you couldn't see your hand held at arm's length. The world became a screaming white chaos, where direction lost all meaning. Cowboys who'd been a mile from the bunkhouse when the wind started faced a terrible choice. Try to make it back and risk getting lost and dying, or try to find any shelter at all and hole up until it passed. Some made it back, stumbling into the bunkhouse half frozen, faces covered in ice where their breath had condensed and frozen, in their scarves. Others weren't so lucky. A young cowboy named Billy Henderson, 18 years old, had been checking on a small herd in a draw maybe 2 miles from the main ranch. When the storm hit, he tried to make it back. His horse refused. To face into the wind, kept trying to turn and run south. Billy fought the horse, knowing that south led away from shelter, from life. The horse won the fight, turned, and ran with the storm. Billy's body was found 3 weeks later, 15 miles south of the ranch, frozen solid, still in the saddle. The horse had died beneath him, also frozen, its legs locked in a final stride. Billy had tied himself to the saddle with his lariat so he wouldn't fall off. It hadn't saved him, but that tragedy was still in the future. At noon on January 9th, Billy was just missing, and everyone assumed he'd found shelter somewhere and would show up when the storm passed. People didn't yet understand that this storm wasn't going to pass. Not in hours, not in days. The temperature kept falling. By 2 in the afternoon, it was 0. By 4, it was 20 below. The wind, instead of slacking, grew stronger. It found every crack in every wall, every gap in every window frame. In the bunkhouse, Men stuffed blankets against the door, hung canvas over the oiled paper window, and fed the stove constantly, but the cold still invaded. Snow didn't just fall, it flew sideways, driven by wind that hit 50, 60 miles per hour in gusts. The snow was fine and dry, almost like dust, and it found its way through impossibly small openings. It drifted through the cracks between logs. It sifted around the doorframe despite the blankets stuffed there. It even seemed to come down the stovepipe, hissing when it hit the hot metal. Inside the bunkhouse, men watched drifts form along the walls. Inside the building, snow accumulated in the corners, under the bunks, anywhere the wind could push it. They swept it out, but it just came back. Eventually, they gave up and let it pile. The sound was overwhelming. The wind screamed. There's no other word for it. A constant, piercing shriek that vibrated in your bones and made thought difficult. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes dropping to a mere roar before surging back to that terrible scream. Men had to shout to be heard 3 feet away. Between the wind's screams came other sounds. The building itself groaning under the assault. The roof lifting and settling as wind tried to peel it off. The sharp crack of wood contracting in the cold. The rattle of the stovepipe shaking in its collar. And from outside, distant but unmistakable, the sound of cattle, bawling, calling, the sound of thousands of animals confused and frightened and beginning to suffer. The cowboys listened to that sound and knew they were helpless. You couldn't go out in this. Going out meant dying. The cattle were on their own. The temperature hit 40 below by midnight. Inside the bunkhouse, with the stove glowing red hot, the temperature near the stove was maybe 50 degrees. 10 feet away, it was freezing. 20 feet away, in the corner bunks, water left in cups froze solid. Men piled on every piece of clothing they owned. 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, 2 coats, gloves and mittens worn indoors, blankets wrapped around shoulders like shawls. Some men wrapped their heads in scarves, leaving only their eyes visible, and still they shivered. The night of January 9th was the longest night most of those men ever experienced. Sleep was impossible for many. The cold, the sound, the fear, the knowledge that outside cattle were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands, all combined to keep eyes open and minds racing. Those who did sleep did so fitfully, waking every few minutes from nightmares or from the cold penetrating their blanket cocoons, or from the building shaking in a particularly hard gust. The fire had to be fed constantly, every 15 minutes, every half hour at most, because letting it die meant everyone would die with it. Men took shifts by silent agreement. One would get up, face the cold outside his blankets, feed the stove, and retreat. An hour later, someone else would do the same. All night long through those terrible hours, they kept the fire alive, and the fire kept them alive. But just barely. By dawn on January 10th, 16 inches of snow had fallen, though you couldn't measure it accurately because the wind had sculpted it into drifts 20 feet high in some places, while scouring other areas down to bare ground. The temperature had dropped to 46 below zero. The wind hadn't slacked at all, and the storm was just beginning. This wasn't a 2-day blizzard that would blow through and leave clear, cold weather behind. This was the start of a meteorological siege that would last, with brief breaks, through all of January, through February, into March. The great die-up had begun. Men didn't know that yet, huddled in bunkhouses across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory. They thought they were waiting out a bad storm. A few days, maybe a week, and it would clear. The cattle would be weak and scattered, but they'd recover. Spring would come, as it always did. They didn't yet understand that the world outside was dying, that cattle were already freezing where they stood, eyes frozen shut, ice forming over their nostrils with each breath, slowly suffocating as they slowly froze. That the open range, cattle industry, the boom that had made fortunes and drawn investors from around the world, was ending in that screaming wind. All they knew was cold. Cold beyond anything most had experienced. Cold that hurt to breathe, that made your lungs ache, that turned your breath to ice crystals before it cold fully leave your mouth. Cold that was no longer just weather, but an active presence, a malevolent force trying to kill everything that lived. And the night ahead, the second night of the storm, would be even colder. -50, -60 in some locations. Cold that would crack trees. Cold that would freeze cattle solid while they stood. Cold that would seep through every wall, every blanket, every layer of clothing, searching for the warmth of human bodies and slowly, inexorably, draining it away. The cowboys fed the fire and waited. There was nothing else they could do. The Yiwa storm had them trapped as surely as if they were in a prison. All they could do was feed the fire, wrap themselves in blankets, and try to survive until morning, and then survive the morning after that, and the one after that, day after day, night after night, as the storm continued and the temperature stayed brutally, impossibly cold. The great die-up was no longer coming. It was here. Sleep. During the storm wasn't sleep as most people understand it. It was something closer to losing consciousness in brief intervals, the body shutting down, not because it felt safe, but because it couldn't maintain full awareness any longer. The exhaustion of constant vigilance, of shivering, of fighting the cold that pressed in from all sides, eventually overwhelmed even the most determined wakefulness. In the ranch houses scattered across the frozen plains, families faced the storm with a different kind of terror than the cowboys in their bunkhouses. Ranch houses were sturdier than bunkhouses, built to last generations rather than just seasons. They had proper foundations, real windows with glass, doors that fit their frames. But they were also larger, harder to heat, and filled with children who didn't fully understand why the wind screamed so loudly or why Papa looked so worried. The Ferguson family lived in a 2-room cabin near the Musselshell River in Montana. William Ferguson, his wife Martha, and their 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 11. When the storm hit that afternoon of January 9th, William had been out checking on a small herd they kept close to the house. He barely made it back, stumbling through the door with ice caked in his beard and eyebrows, his face raw and bleeding from wind-driven snow. Martha had already pulled all the children into the main room, the one with the fireplace. The second room, the bedroom, was abandoned for the duration. You couldn't heat both rooms. You had to choose, and you chose the one with the fire. The children helped drag mattresses and blankets from the bedroom, piling them on the floor near the hearth. By nightfall, the temperature inside that bedroom, separated from the main room by just a thin wooden door, had dropped below freezing. Frost formed on the inside walls. The wash basin Martha had left on the dresser froze solid, expanding and cracking the ceramic bowl with a sharp report that made everyone jump. In the main room, the family arranged themselves for a siege. William stacked firewood within arm's reach of the fireplace, more wood than he'd normally burn in a week. Martha filled every pot and pan with water, knowing that if the storm lasted, they wouldn't be able to get to the well. The pump would freeze. The well itself might freeze. Water was survival.